Sam Summers is constantly battling this idea of what you see is what you get. Throughout his book, he makes reference to the fact that what you see is what you get is leading to the downfall and misunderstanding of a lot of social situations and broader situations about the world, including stereotypes, gender, race, and love. An example he uses in the beginning of his book is when his wife is talking about how all bus drivers in the city are evil. They're terrible people. And obviously, this is a generalization. And he doesn't just defeat the argument by saying that, okay, this is a generalization. He details to his wife that if they didn't have some of these tendencies of being aggressive and putting themselves into these situations where they might get yelled at, really for driving, I guess, then they wouldn't be able to do their jobs in the best way because they need to get from route to route on time. And it takes a lot of courage to be a bus driver driving a giant bus in the middle of traffic. Situations matter is not just a refutation of what you see is what you get. It's kind of an introduction to this idea of situations matter, and he makes reference to it when it's relatable to the topic. Um, Instead, he focuses on the application of situations matter and the application of context and what you can use context for in your own lives and trying to be as successful as Sam Summers focuses a lot on application. And he talks about how crowds can prevent people from actually helping. And when you would think that, oh, there's lots of people there to judge you, so that you'd be pushed forward, he says the opposite, to where the crowd almost becomes an excuse to where you think that someone else from the crowd will go help if a person needs help, or someone else will go do it. And that if everyone else isn't doing it, then you probably shouldn't do it. We rely on these people for information, and we trust them for almost no. I love this is what Summers says that he does with all of his lecture halls, is while he's giving a presentation on helping others, as there's a slide on the screen, he drops his papers in a dramatic fashion and falls and tumbles, and he sees if anyone's going to help him get him up. And consistently, every time, as he says, he's done it probably hundreds of times, no one goes to help him up. Lecture hall full of hundred something kids. No one even reaches for the papers. No one says, or no one goes forward and tries to assist him. And this differs when he's in an individual session and does the same thing, to where if there's a kid or two there and he drops his papers, of course they rush really quickly to help him up. And this inertia of the crowd preventing people from going to help, saying, well, if no one's helping, why should I? And with that, when everyone has this mentality, nothing gets done. No one helps. And he says that this is not a good thing, at least when you're in the crowd, to be forced into this, standstill. But when you're not in the crowd, and even when you are in the crowd, and you realize that this phenomenon is happening, to where the crowd feels like they're forced to do nothing because no one else is doing anything, you can use that, and you can combat that in ways that, in terms of appealing to individuals instead of the crowd, like they do with commercials for like AIDS or like giving food to Africa. They don't say, hey, America, we need your help, America, or even your state or your town or your region, right? That's hard. That's hard stuff to get, because people will always assume that there's someone else that's willing to do it, and that someone else thinks that there's someone else, and the chain continues. Instead, they apply directly to the individual, so that there's no excuse. There's no one that they can turn on and say they're going to do it. One of the most interesting sections that I found was how Summers talks about cults and cult-like organizations, including the army, specifically the Abu Ghraib prison scandal of 2004, and how the public kind of attacked the bad apples, the ones that were caught. Specifically, this girl Lindy England, who's caught, kind of smiling and all happy, while in the background there are prisoners being tortured and humiliated. And the public, as he says, adopted this "what you see is what you get" mentality, to where she must be deranged. There's something wrong with her. And Summer says the opposite. He says this is a normal girl. Obviously not normal at the point of taking the picture, but before, she was kind of the opposite of what the public saw. She was a conformity-resisting whistleblower. She quit a job at a chicken processing plant because the management had ignored her complaints about health code violations. And he says that the system that the army puts in, and the methods that they use to boost this community of the army and normalize the torturing was the only thing that drove her to be smiling in this picture and think that this is okay. Um, so she wasn't a bad person to begin with. It was the situation that she was put in that affected her decisions and normalizes for her and got her to put that. Backed up this idea that put into the right situation or the wrong situation, people do horrible things that we find non-human or quite like these bad apples. What are they doing? But normal people. And in fact, he references a study in which Yale students were put in this situation and did terrible things, in which they were told that they were put into a study where to see how punishment affects learning. And there were teachers who were allowed to administer shocks to the other participant, who was actually a trained actor on the other side of this wall, whenever they got a question wrong. All right. And as they went up, the increments of shocks, the actors would, scream, when they're approaching 150 volts, to say, please help me, please help. I have a heart condition. I got to get out of here. And by 350 volts, there was no response. They wouldn't answer the questions. All right. When the room was empty, the Yale students, only 3% of them went up to the maximum voltage, 450, in which it was labeled XXX. Okay. Which would be seen as very dangerous, especially to this other participant. But when there was a scientist in there with a white lab coat, seen as an authoritarian figure, the Yale students, 67% of them, 65%, went up to this 450 volt range. And the scientist authoritarian figure was not forcing them to do it. All he said was, please continue, or please go on. And this small little change in the situation resulted in the dramatic increase of these Yale students who are thought to be like the highest of education and morality in a society, the elite, the top level, of shocking this man on the other side of a wall to extreme lengths for just not being able to answer a question right. And Summers detailed that this small change in the situation, if it can do that to a Yale student with Summers also used research to back up this idea that in the right or wrong situations, normal people can become bad apples. Milgram's 1960s obedience studies at Yale, normal participants that were not Yale students, people from just around the local community, were assigned the role of a teacher, an experiment that they thought was how punishment affects learning. So for each wrong answer, they were supposed to shock the other participant, who was an actor, because there weren't actual shocks, with increasing severity, starting with 0 volts all the way up to 450 volts, with an increase of 15 volts each time. And labels on the volts were described as moderate shock at 75 volts, at 135 volts strong shock, and at 375 volts danger severe shock was written, and at 435 only an ominous XXX. There was a dialogue between the actor and the participant. And so while the actors weren't actually getting shocked, there were pre-recorded sound bites of moans, complaints, and eventually screams that were heard through the intercom by the participant. And like 150 volts, they would scream, "Get me out of here. I told you I had heart problems. My heart's starting to bother me." At 160, at 180, "I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here." And at 300, "I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Get me out of here. You can't hold me here. Get me out." And at 345 volts, the actor stopped responding all entirely. As Milgram emphasized, these participants were ordinary Americans, postal clerks, high school teachers, salesmen, engineers, and laborers. It wasn't station in life, gender, or personality that predicted willingness to inflict harm. It was it can be seen as a strength or a weakness of the study. But for the larger idea, I would definitely see it as a strength, in that variations of Milgram's original study kind of highlight the power of the situations. When they take the research from a university setting to an urban office building, fewer than 50% of the participants went to the end of the shock panel. And when the experimenter shed his lab coat, the rate fell below 20%. So it shows that while these people definitely were influenced. There's a specific reason that they were influenced, whether it be the authoritarian figure because he's wearing a lab coat, or the environment that they're put in. And that these little differences make a really big difference on the outcome in terms of how many people are going to the end of that. Summers did a good job of relaying the details and the main ideas of the study, and using the fact that it was a Yale study to make it seem reputable without having to put in all the additional details and information that would kind of bore the reader, because this is supposed to sell books in the long. Another study that I thought was really interesting was when Summers is talking about love and attraction, and how while we think we are totally clear-minded on what we want, the situation and the context of that attraction actually really. University of Pittsburgh professor arranged for 3 women to sit in his class over the course of the semester. One woman sitting there only 5 times, the next 10, and the last 15. At the end of the semester, the professor asked the students in the class to rank the women on a scale of familiarity and attractiveness. And as you expect, the familiarity went from lowest being 5 to 10 and then to 15, 15 being the highest. And attractiveness also followed the same pattern. And when asked why they ranked the women in this way, the classroom didn't know. They were largely confused on why they had ranked the one woman more attractive than the last, because there was a significant margin. Interesting, though, is that the discrepancy between the 5 class girl and the 15 and the 10 class girl, the difference in how familiar they were was very small, whereas the difference of attractiveness was much larger, meaning that the students didn't know that these women were that much more familiar to them, but they got a sense of that they were more attractive because of this kind of like subconscious familiarity. This is supposed to be almost an easy to read book. Summers uses limited detail in the study, summing it up to a paragraph or 2, with an elaboration later on the different types of how familiarity impacts attractiveness. So I definitely would have liked to see more detail, more evidence backing this up, instead of a kind of bland summary of it. But it still is cool to see, and if you buy into Summers, and you can look up this study, it's a real thing. I looked it up. You can definitely get more detail on it. So the study itself is credible, but Summers sums it up as you're supposed to trust him and sees the edge. You really, after reading this book, understand the power situations and how they're so entrenched in our society. They become fact. The what you see is what you get mentalities become fact, and that these situations have become unaddressed. And the biggest thing that I saw correlating with this was the gender differences, specifically with math, and that you remind a girl that she's a girl before a test, and her scores plummet. And versus you read her an article in a room filled with boys and girls, how there's no gender difference between girls and boys, and their scores go up. In fact, they sometimes score higher. Or like the aggression levels of boys and girls, to where if they're playing a game and they think that there's a focus on them and they're being recorded, the girls tend to be less aggressive in the game, and the boys tend to be more aggressive. Versus when there's a camera off them, as there was one study which Summers talked about, when they were just playing the game as a control group, the girls were in fact more aggressive than the boys. And that putting this spotlight on girls, especially and shining all of society's stereotypes about girls, and that they're less good at math. They're more emotionally available. They're more they have a better emotional spectrum, but they're less aggressive, and they're sadder, and they cry more. It's pushing these girls into this situation, which is it's putting them in a cycle where they're emulating the stereotype because of the stereotype. And I think that's pretty crazy. And I think that doesn't get enough recognition. I think we talk about that in class for sure. But like he definitely addresses that there are biological differences for sure. And I think that's something that if he would not have addressed, it would have made him way less credible. That he recognizes that there are biological differences between boys and girls. But he also recognizes, well, at least he states, that recognizes that the situational differences are the key factor, and that biological differences are maybe evidence in some situations to some of these. What you see is what you get. The connection I thought was cool was the connection between situations, matter, and growth mindset, in which Sam Summers, without actually saying growth mindset. He talks about growth mindset. He talks about Hong Kong students that were asked, that were given a series of statements, basically asking, do they believe that intelligence is stable, static force, or is it malleable and can it be improved? And that the people that thought it could be improved had higher GPAs, and this kind of agreeing with that statement correlated with better success. It takes a different spin on growth mindset. With the same kind of you can improve yourself, he also mainly focuses on there is no yourself, true yourself, and that who you are today doesn't completely impact who you are tomorrow, and that there can be rapid change relying on the situation. And I think that's great because people that want to stick to what people believe that they are, and people that really emphasize the stereotypes that other people give them, especially with like the gender thing, and saying that you can get better and you can define these, and these don't make you who you are, because who you are can change. So if you think that, oh, I'm a bad math student, okay, you're a bad math student now. You're not going to be if you work hard. That's not you. That's who you are in this current situation, in this current time. And I don't know. I really clicked with that. That's one of my favorite kind of new philosophies that I've adopted. Summers does a little experiment with the reader. He gives you a list of words and says, okay, there's unpleasant words, gross, disgusting, and pleasant words like rainbow or wealth. Okay. For the pleasant words, he tells you tap your left thigh. Unpleasant, right thigh. So you go through, read them, you tap, tap, tap. Then he gives you another list. He says, okay, white names and pleasant words go together. Black names and unpleasant words go together. Tap your right thigh for the black and unpleasant words, and tap your left thigh for the nice and nice words and white names. Okay, so you go do that. Then the last set of words is different. He gives you different instructions. He says, okay, I want you to put the black and the pleasant name and the pleasant words together, and the white and the unpleasant words together. And this seems easy. This seems like, okay, whatever. This is fine. Like you think going in that there's going to be no difference, but it's not like something you can't do, but you have to readjust every time. You have to slower, more stuttered kind of pattern with the tapping. And he knows this is going to happen because he says that we associate, white with good and black with bad. It's literally harder to do it. And I don't see myself as, a person that I'm not. It's easy. Yeah, you're not racist is what he says. But, society has conditioned us to kind of think that way. And no matter how good of a person you think you are, people are put into a situation where they associate white with good and black with bad. So it's harder to do it. And he addresses, and he shows that people have their bias, whether they think they do or not. There's no way to get rid of it. You can't get rid of your bias. And that realizing that we can look for the things we do in our own lives and say, okay, that wasn't weird. But would you have really acted that way if it was a white guy, is what he's saying. Like if you're talking with a black guy and say, hey, do you have any plans for after high school? Versus you're talking with a white guy, hey, which college are you going to? The little stuff like that makes a big difference. It gives you a book that you can take a lot from. He shows you that you have a bias for sure, especially in that last chapter with the race game, and that you got to address it if you want to. You can combat it knowing about it, knowing the situation, the context the schema that you're in. The gender thing, that was crazy. I did not expect that. That I definitely I've heard the biological appeals that, okay, men and women are different, men are going to be better at certain things, but the situation of how that really can impact very quickly, just the mindset that these women are in can change their math scores or their test scores that dramatically, I thought was pretty insane. And just like being a leader, in the earlier chapters, he detailed this man who would go to like Cavs games or hockey games, and he would dress as like one of the normal people because he was a fan. That's how he started out, and would get the crowds going wild. And he would do this by alleviating. He would get the crowd inertia rolling by being the craziest, most insane fan ever, and that these people would think, okay, this guy's doing all this insane stuff, pretty much a fat dude just like stripping off, doing strip teases and stuff, then I can stand up and clap and cheer. and and there's so much in this book that in terms of application that it's hard to go through all of it. But you can get out of this book what you want to. If you want to go in and just get the mindset of what the situations, how to view them and get rid of this what you see is what you get mentality, that's good. And I think that's going to happen. And you can also key in on the specific examples and the applications that he gives kind of at the end of each chapter of just what you can do specifically with this information. Whether it comes to being a better manager or it comes to finding or getting better, picking up girls better. He even gives like 3 steps. It's like familiarity, reciprocity, and just being nice. Yeah, he gives you a lot of stuff that you can apply to your life. I mean, but he also gives you a whole mindset, like the growth mindset. He gives you a mindset that you can apply to anything, regardless of whether he talked about it. Overall, I think this is a great read. It shapes your perception of the world, and it definitely changes how you look at it. It changes your schema, for sure. And I think that most people should read this book, and it's very helpful, especially people that aren't keen to social behaviors. They can really get a good methodical understanding of how to use and manipulate social standards and guidelines, and just how we interact with people in different situations without kind of having this training of throughout their whole life, especially with IB kids. Some of them have been sheltered, such as like the tag program, have been sheltered in kind of a bubble to where it's not normal average people that they're interacting with. And then there are different rules, and that reading this book can help these kids, including myself, thrive in other environments without kind of the social muscle memory that most other kids have had in these other social settings.